With the constant release of new superhero and comic book movies, it's very easy to end up forgetting some of them very quickly or not even realizing that they're released. Sometimes a movie releases and you can't go onto the internet without reading and hearing people talk about them, whether it be because they were good movies or because they were bad. Just bad. But sometimes a movie gets released and no one notices, like that Crow remake or Bloodshot. Remember Bloodshot? Exactly, and there was one comic book movie that came out recently which I was personally anticipating, but that really went under the radar and not that many people ended up seeing it. I'm talking about Hellboy the Crooked Man, which did get people talking about it when its trailer released, but most people were not feeling it, with some saying that the movie looked too cheap and uninteresting. And it's truly a shame that so many people discarded it so easily because it's actually a fairly good movie, albeit with some notable flaws. And while I do commend it for trying to be a more faithful adaptation of the original Hellboy comics and the specific storyline it's based on, I still think that Hellboy hasn't been able to be faithfully adapted in live action, neither in The Crooked Man nor in the previous films. Even the Guillermo del Toro movies missed the mark in that regard, since while they were legitimately very good movies, they weren't really very good adaptations of Mike Mignola's work, given that they made unnecessary changes and overall didn't completely translate the spirit and atmosphere of the original comics. However, something that I and many other fans have always thought is that they should give Hellboy an animated series. An animated show would be the perfect format for Hellboy because it manages to be a very serialized and episodic comic book while also having a deep overarching storyline. His role as the world's greatest paranormal investigator is the perfect excuse to have the character facing off against a new monster of the week and explore different kinds of mythologies, religions, and folklore from all over the world. And, in my opinion, it will always be more cost-effective and creatively liberating to make a Hellboy series in animation rather than in live action, because the comics have a lot of different locations and monsters that would be far too expensive to create all the different sets and effects that would be necessary to make a good adaptation. Also, a huge reason why Hellboy comics are so beloved is due to Mike Mignola's incredible artwork that plays a huge part in setting the atmosphere and mood of the stories, most often complemented by Dave Stewart's amazing bold colors, since he's the primary colorist for most Hellboy comics, and this unique visual aesthetic hasn't been able to be properly adapted into live action. Animation would be a better fit for a project like this, and what's interesting about all this is that we have seen Hellboy in animation before. During the mid-2000s, while the Del Toro films were being made, we also saw the release of a project called Hellboy Animated, which were a series of movies and shorts that attempted to create a more faithful adaptation of Hellboy in animation. And so Revolution Studios, which co-produced the Del Toro films, also co-produced the animated movies, and their animation was done by the Japanese studio Madhouse, which has done animation for series like One Punch Man, Death Note, Hunter x Hunter, and many more. They released two animated movies, Sword of Storms in 2006 and Blood and Iron in 2007. Sword of Storms has Hellboy going to Japan to investigate the case of a professor who was possessed by the demons of thunder and lightning, based on the same elemental gods from Japanese mythology and Shinto religion. All the while Abe Sapien and Liz Sherman deal with a powerful dragon. The plot of the movie is a bit meandering, with Hellboy fighting yokai after yokai a bit aimlessly, until Thunder and Lightning eventually get freed into the real world, and they are defeated by Hellboy. But it's still a pretty enjoyable movie. It has a closer tone to the comics with how it balances the mystery elements of the story with its pulp superhero-esque sensibilities, while also having a sense of horror as well. The characterizations for Hellboy, Abe, and Liz are all more faithful to how they act in the source material. They also adapted Kate Corrigan, who's a great supporting character that's been ignored by the live-action movies. All of these elements are something that I appreciate to see in a Hellboy adaptation. Now, the second movie, Blood and Iron, is honestly my favorite adaptation of Hellboy so far, and one of the character's best pieces of media outside the comics. It has Hellboy and the BPRD facing off against a vampire lady from Eastern Europe that used to bathe in the blood of young women to rejuvenate herself. She was defeated in the past by Professor Broom and has now returned. It also serves as a loose adaptation of Wake the Devil, a fantastic story from the comics that expanded on Hellboy's origin and also deals with vampires, although it was a different Nazi-affiliated vampire. And the movie even adapted this great exchange between Hellboy and Hecate, the Queen of Witches, where she chastises Hellboy for going against his own kind as a demon and monster, refusing to accept his true role as the great beast and harbinger of the apocalypse on Earth.
Now, accept what you are. Come and walk with me.
Lady, I was gonna cut you some slack, because you're a major mythological figure. That's crazy talk. Now leave me alone!
The movie's art style is a good minimalist translation of Mike Mignola's artwork, simplified in such a way that it'd be easier to actually animate. It's not really my preferred look for a Hellboy animated series, but I still think it's good. If this style seems familiar to you, it might be because the character designs were done by artist Sean Galloway, who also worked as the lead character designer for Spectacular Spider-Man. So these movies are basically like a Hellboy cartoon in the style of Spectacular Spider-Man, with blood and an overall darker vibe. And if you're a fan of the comics, I highly recommend you check them out, especially Blood and Iron, since it's the only adaptation that's been able to properly depict the horror, mystery, and pulp tone of the source material. And what's cool about both animated movies is that Ron Perlman, Doug Jones, and the entire cast of the Del Toro movies return to voice their characters, which is really awesome. Despite those being the only two movies, there were also a couple of Hellboy animated shorts. The DVD release of Blood and Iron included a 3-minute short as a bonus titled Iron Shoes, and it featured Hellboy fighting against a troll from old Irish folklore, and it was actually based on a short comic book story from Mignola of the same name. Years later in 2010, they also released a short titled The Dark Below, which showed Hellboy fighting against a Lovecraftian tentacle monster. Hellboy was voiced by Zebulon Pike rather than Ron Perlman, and in contrast to the previous animated projects, this short was actually done in cel-shaded CGI rather than hand-drawn 2D animation, and it honestly doesn't look bad. It's very similar to the visual style of an indie video game that released many years later in 2023 called Hellboy Web of Weird, a game that's honestly pretty good. Its gameplay can get a bit repetitive, especially since it's a roguelike, but its art style is awesome in my opinion. I love cel-shaded graphics, and I think that in this case they do a great job in depicting Mike Mignola's minimalist, angular artwork with bold colors contrasted with deep shadows. It's a really great visual style, and I wouldn't be against seeing a Hellboy animated series with CG animation like this. And again, I also recommend this game if you're a Hellboy fan. I even got it on the Switch, and it's a good old fun time. Look at that. Look at that Joy-Con drift. Other works of animation that gives us an idea as to how Mike Mignola's art style could be adapted in animation are the DC movies Gotham by Gaslight and The Doom That Came to Gotham, which are both movies that adapt Elseworld stories that were worked on by Mignola, but they didn't really try to fully recreate the same art style as the original graphic novels. They had a more minimalist look similar to the DCAU art style, especially Gotham by Gaslight, although they were still pretty good movies. While the art styles we've seen so far are all nice, and any one of them could serve just fine for an animated adaptation of Hellboy, my dream art style for a Hellboy animated series and my favorite translation of Mignola's art style in animation actually comes from a failed pilot for a cartoon adaptation of The Amazing Screw-On Head. This idea was pitched to the Sci-Fi Channel in 2006, and it was developed by writer Brian Fuller, producer Jason Netter, and director Chris Paranowski, with involvements from Mignola himself. The pilot adapted a one-shot comic book from Mignola about a robot superhero that's able to screw his head onto multiple different bodies, and who worked for Abraham Lincoln in order to protect the United States from monsters and other supernatural threats. Set in an alternate reality steampunk 19th century, since Mignola had only written a single one-shot story about the concept, they had to flesh out more the world of the character in order to create a premise that could sustain an entire series, so they greatly expanded on the idea. And the final result is honestly the most visually faithful adaptation of any work by Mike Mignola, including all of Hellboy's adaptations. They managed to perfectly capture the comic's tone and sense of humor. The pilot was really funny.
I'm merely expressing gratitude. Perhaps you might express an apology. Oh, no, he didn't. Apologize to you? Pardon me if I say poppycock.
Then say it.
Poppycock.
You let America down.
And of course, as you can see, the pilot is also visually stunning. It's beautiful in my opinion. And during the series production, the only mandate that Mignola ever told the production team is that the pilot should try to emulate his art style as much as possible and make it work in animation, and I gotta say they did a fantastic job. The show's visuals capture Mignola's detailed yet minimalist style with a great use of shadows and color composition. The animation itself is also very fluid and expressive, greatly enhancing its action scenes and also its more comedic moments. I would personally absolutely love to see a Hellboy series with the same animation as this failed pilot. It would literally be a dream come true. The Amazing Screw-On Head was sadly rejected by the Sci-Fi Channel at the time, mainly because the network was prioritizing more live-action shows and weren't really looking to produce animated projects. Besides that, I think that another reason the pilot was rejected was, ironically, its fantastic art style. Since, while the art and animation quality was undeniably great, it also takes a lot of time and resources to animate a show with such a detailed style. This is why many animated projects end up simplifying their art style so that they could be more easily animated, which is exactly why the Hellboy animated movies had a more minimalist look. The Amazing Screw-On Head's pilot was sadly passed on despite its great potential, and to this day the only Mignola property that's been able to become recognizable in pop culture is still Hellboy, and his place in pop culture is really thanks to the films directed by Guillermo del Toro. I, like many other people, including many of you I imagine, was first introduced to Hellboy and his world through the Del Toro films, which I've always personally loved. I think they're great movies. Years later though, I checked out the original comics as an adult and saw that those movies had actually made a number of significant changes to the source material. Stuff like Hellboy and Liz Sherman having a romantic relationship that always felt really tacked on and forced, but that was actually completely fabricated for the movies. In the comics they have a more brother-sister type relationship, with no hints of anything beyond that. I imagine that this was most likely changed for the adaptation due to pressure from the studio, since Hollywood is infamous for obligating basically all action movie protagonists to have a love interest, and in the case of the Hellboy movies, it really wasn't necessary at all. Another thing that's kind of frustrating is how Hellboy's characterization was changed. In the comics he has a dry, somewhat sarcastic sense of humor, but with a sense of maturity and weariness due to all of the years he has spent as a paranormal investigator. Like he's jaded and tired from everything he's seen, which is why he treats the extraordinary situations he gets involved in as if they were completely ordinary. He's a genuinely good person that usually shows restraint and knows when to be quiet. In the Del Toro movies, however, he's kind of the opposite of that. He makes way too many jokes, quips, and sarcastic comments in situations where the character should really show more restraint. He's more immature and comes off as acting like a teenager sometimes, when he's actually supposed to be a 50-year-old dude. It's pretty different than how he acts in the comics, and overall, the Del Toro movies just weren't able to fully capture the horror atmosphere of the source material, and they felt more like traditional superhero movies that stayed closer to Guillermo del Toro's vision rather than Mignola's. They are still really good movies, but as adaptations, they're kind of lacking. Then we have the 2019 reboot directed by Neil Marshall, and starring David Harbour as Hellboy, which did try to stay closer to the comics with them delving into Hellboy's role as the Great Beast, and how he was summoned on Earth to bring forth the apocalypse. But the problem is that they tried to cram in way too much stuff into the movie. It felt like they tried to speedrun in a couple hours Hellboy's entire story arc, which spanned years worth of comics, so it really felt like a shallow, surface level adaptation in the movie. It was nice to see elements from the comics like the Baba Yaga mentioning how Hellboy damaged her eye, or Lobster Johnson's cameo appearance, but if the movie had a more focused script it would have been much better. Also, despite them trying to be truer to the comics, they still missed the mark with Hellboy's characterization. His personality again is way too immature, and he has some ridiculous daddy issues with Professor Broom, which made Hellboy's character feel really whiny and irritating. Then we have The Crooked Man, which was good, but kinda bland and forgettable to be honest. Jack Kesey gave a good performance as Hellboy, which felt much more in line with how the character acts in the source material, and I really love that they genuinely tried to stay true to the comic it's based on, but the editing really brought down the movie for me. It felt distractingly erratic, and had a lot of cuts during action scenes that made them less readable. The cinematography was also really bland, with an excessive amount of Dutch angles and weird shots. The performances from the supporting cast also felt pretty underwhelming. with some actors putting on some really bad, unconvincing accents that felt distracting. I do think that they did a good job with the movie's atmosphere and horror tone, yet it sadly felt undeniably low quality in other aspects. But overall, I still think they did a good job with a relatively low budget of $20 million they had. But could you imagine the kind of animated series that could be made with $20 million? I mean, animation is still expensive. A show like Invincible reportedly cost $750,000 an episode, but they've repeatedly been willing to invest millions of dollars into live-action Hellboy adaptations that have underperformed at the box office. Even the Del Toro movies weren't massive hits, and they were more like moderate successes. So instead of trying to make the character work yet again in live action, they could take advantage of the rise in popularity of adult animated shows and make a truly faithful adaptation. Imagine a show that adapts Hellboy's storyline in sequential order like they've adapted the Invincible comics. They could cover the entire Hellboy story, from his summoning on Earth at the hands of Rasputin and the Nazis, to his career as a paranormal investigator with the BPRD and the eventual coming of Ragnarok, with them following the Nazi occultists that survived the Second World War. They could do an anthology series that jumps around different time periods, adapting varied stories set in different times, and even give solo stories to characters like Abe Sapien, Lobster Johnson, the BPRD, Sir Edward Grey, and more. Great stories like Conqueror Worm, The Corpse, Darkness Calls, Strange Places, The Chained Coffin all deserve to be adapted into animation. I mean, the entire Hellboy universe of comics deserve to be adapted in animation, and I will never get tired of saying that. While Hellboy may not be the most popular character, it's still undeniably one of those indie comics that were able to have an impact with the general audiences. So even though he isn't extremely popular, he is still a recognizable character, and that does give worth to his IP. I sincerely believe that The Crooked Man won't be the last Hellboy adaptation we'll see, despite it not being a hit, and the next time they decide to make a new adaptation, I honestly believe that an animated series would be the best choice. Simply put, if tomorrow a new Hellboy live-action movie was announced, I don't really think that many people would be too excited. However, if they were to announce a Hellboy animated show, I absolutely think that most hardcore and casual fans would get very, very excited, myself included. But as always, that's only my opinion. What do you guys think though? Would you also like to see a Hellboy animated series? What comics have you always wanted to see get adapted? What do you think of Hellboy's live-action movies? Comment below your thoughts, and as always, thank you so much for watching.